1. The quiet beginning. She didn't ask for love. She didn't ask to be chosen. She just stayed. And somehow, that broke her more than leaving ever could. If this kind of quiet pain feels familiar to you, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast now. These are the stories we were never taught how to name. Claire was never loud about love. She didn't arrive with demands. She didn't ask questions that might make things uncomfortable. She believed that if she stayed calm, if she stayed kind, love would eventually notice her. Ethan noticed, of course. He noticed the way she adapted to his silence. The way she waited without checking the time. The way she smiled, even when nothing was given back. At first, it felt peaceful. Two people. No arguments. No dramatic scenes. Just space. But space, when left untouched for too long, doesn't stay empty. It fills with doubt. Claire told herself this was maturity. That real love didn't need reassurance. That needing less meant loving better. So she learned to soften her voice. To delay her feelings. To hold her needs quietly, like something fragile that might shatter the moment it was spoken. Ethan never asked her to do this. And that was the problem. He didn't reject her. He didn't push her away. He simply remained unavailable. Present, but unreachable. There, but never fully with her. And Claire mistook that absence for depth. She thought silence meant safety. She thought staying meant strength. This was the beginning. Not of love, but of a quiet disappearance. 2. Love without demands. Claire loved the way some people breathe. Quietly, automatically, as if it didn't cost anything. She didn't say, prove it. She didn't say, choose me. She didn't even say, I'm scared. Instead, she adjusted. If Ethan forgot to text, she told herself he was busy. If he went distant, she told herself he was tired. If he offered half a smile and nothing more, she treated it like a gift. Because Claire had learned something early. Asking for too much makes you too much. So she loved without demands. No deadlines. No expectations. No, where are we going? No, what are we? Just loyalty. Just presence. And people praised her for it. You're so understanding. You're so low maintenance. You're so easy to be with. Claire would smile at those words. But inside, something tightened. Because being easy wasn't the same as being held. Ethan liked her calm. He liked that she didn't pull at him. He liked that she didn't challenge the quiet parts of him. With Claire, he could show up and still keep his distance. He could be admired without being required. Some nights, he would reach for her hand like a habit, warm for a moment, then gone. A touch that said, I'm here. Without ever saying, I'm with you. Claire didn't complain. She didn't ask for more. She didn't risk becoming a problem. She made love smaller, so it could fit inside his comfort. And this is how it happened. Not with cruelty, not with betrayal, but with a soft, repeating pattern. She gave. He received. And the silence kept the score. Claire told herself, if I don't ask, I won't be disappointed. If I don't need, I won't be rejected. If I stay quiet, I'll stay chosen. But love without demands doesn't stay pure. It becomes a test no one agreed to take. Because a part of her was always waiting. For Ethan to notice what she never said out loud. For him to offer what she pretended she didn't need. And when he didn't, she didn't get angry. She just got emptier. Not because he stopped loving her, but because she stopped asking to be loved. In a way that could actually reach her. 3. When silence felt like peace. At first, the silence felt like peace. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No long, dramatic talks that ended in tears. Just quiet. Just fine. And Claire, she mistook that fine for safety. Because when you've lived through chaos, stillness feels like love. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand explanations. He simply didn't ask for much. So Claire learned to match him. She stopped bringing up the heavy things. Stopped saying, "Can we talk?" Stopped asking, "Did I do something wrong?" Not because she didn't feel it, but because she didn't want to be the reason the peace broke. There's a certain kind of relief when someone doesn't confront you, when they don't question your emotions, when they don't push back. But that relief can be a trap. Because the silence doesn't mean everything is okay. It just means nothing is being named. Claire started to notice how quiet the house could get. Not the calm kind of quiet. The kind that feels like you're living beside someone, instead of with them. Ethan would come home, keys in his hand, eyes on his phone, a quick, "Hey," a tired smile. Then, he would disappear into his own world. And Claire would let him. She'd make dinner softer, less seasoning, less risk. She'd choose movies that didn't stir feelings. She'd keep her stories short, her tone light. Anything to protect the silence. Anything to keep the surface smooth. Because every time she almost spoke the truth. "I miss you. I feel lonely. I need you to see me." She could already hear the invisible consequence. A sigh. A shutdown. A withdrawal. So she swallowed it. And the strange part is, she told herself she was being mature. She told herself this is what adult love looks like. Two people who don't need to constantly reassure each other. But reassurance isn't childish. It's human. And the longer Claire lived without it, the more she started to shrink. Not all at once. Just little by little. Her laughter got quieter. Her questions got fewer. Her heart learned to brace before it reached. Silence can feel like peace. Until you realize it's not peace at all. It's avoidance, wearing a calm face. It's two people keeping everything nice, while something essential is starving underneath. And Claire didn't notice the hunger at first. Because she thought peace meant the absence of conflict, not the presence of connection. So she kept the silence. And in that silence, she slowly became a guest in her own love. 4. Defining abandonment. 1. Abandonment doesn't always look like someone leaving. Sometimes, it looks like someone staying, without ever truly arriving. Claire used to think abandonment was loud. A slammed door. A final argument. A clear goodbye. But what she was living inside had none of that. Ethan didn't disappear. He didn't walk away. He didn't choose someone else. He stayed. And somehow, that made it harder to explain the pain. Because how do you grieve someone who is still sitting across from you? How do you name a loss when nothing was officially taken away? Ethan would listen, but not lean in. He would nod, but not ask more. He would hear her words, without ever hearing her. Claire noticed it in small moments. When she talked about her day, and his eyes drifted elsewhere. When she shared something tender, and the response came back practical. Not cruel. Not dismissive. Just empty. That's when she began to understand something terrifying. You can be emotionally abandoned by someone who never leaves your side. Because abandonment isn't about absence. It's about unavailability. It's about reaching out and feeling nothing reach back. Claire stopped asking herself, "Why doesn't he love me?" Instead, a quieter question appeared. Is he even capable of meeting me here? And that question hurt more. Because it had no villain. Ethan wasn't trying to hurt her. He simply didn't know how to show up in the places she needed. So she kept lowering the bar. Kept translating her needs into something smaller, quieter, safer. Until one night, the truth landed gently, but clearly. She wasn't asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person to be fully present. And that realization, that this emptiness wasn't temporary, was the first real crack in the silence. Because once you can name abandonment, you can no longer pretend you're whole. Claire sat with that word, abandonment, and felt how strange it sounded in her mouth. No one left. No one slammed a door. But something essential had been missing for a very long time. And now, she could finally feel it. 5. Defining abandonment. 2. Once Claire could name it, she couldn't unsee it. Abandonment wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern. Quiet, consistent, invisible. It showed up in the way Ethan avoided emotional weather. How he stayed neutral when things felt heavy. How he changed the subject right when her voice began to shake. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to stay present. Inside discomfort, Claire began to recognize the cost. Every time she reached for depth, she hit a wall that didn't argue back. A wall that smiled politely and stayed closed. That kind of abandonment is confusing. Because it doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't even deny you outright. It simply withholds. And when something is withheld long enough, you start to believe you never deserved it. Claire noticed how she prepared herself. Before speaking, rehearsing sentences in her head, softening her truth, so it would land gently, so it wouldn't ask too much. She wasn't lying. She was editing herself. To survive the relationship? This is what emotional abandonment does. It teaches you to abandon yourself first. You stop expecting. You stop hoping. You stop reaching. Not because you don't want connection, but because wanting starts to feel unsafe. Ethan, in his own way, felt stable, predictable, unreactive. But stability without emotional access isn't safety. It's still loneliness, just neatly organized. And Claire was tired of explaining her pain to someone who couldn't feel it with her. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need perfection. She needed presence. And realizing that her grief came from absence, not loss, was both devastating and clarifying. Because now she understood. She wasn't broken. She wasn't needy. She wasn't asking for too much. She was responding normally to an abnormal lack of emotional availability. And once that truth settled in her chest, she felt something shift. Not relief, not peace, but awareness. And awareness is the moment abandonment stops being silent. 6. Adapting to less. Claire didn't decide to accept less in one dramatic moment. It happened the way fog happens. Slowly, quietly, until one day you look around and realize you can't see the horizon anymore. She started editing her needs down to the safest size. A hug became a hand on the shoulder. A real conversation became, "How was work?" A longing became a joke, said lightly, so it wouldn't sound like longing at all. And when Ethan gave her something small, a text with a heart, a quick kiss before leaving, "You okay?" without looking up, Claire felt grateful. Not because it was enough, but because she had trained herself to survive on crumbs. That's what adapting to less looks like. You don't protest. You don't demand. You don't even notice it's happening at first. You just learn how to need quietly. Because needing openly starts to feel like begging. And Claire refused to beg. She told herself it was dignity. She told herself it was strength. She told herself she was being easy to love. But deep down, she was doing something else. She was making her heart smaller to fit into Ethan's limitations. She would pause before speaking. Ask herself, is this worth the risk? Risk meaning the sigh, the distance, the shutdown. So she chose the version of herself that could be tolerated. A version that didn't cry too much, didn't ask too many questions, didn't want too many things at once. And the tragedy is, Ethan didn't even ask her to become this. He simply rewarded silence with stability. Whenever Claire stayed calm, the relationship stayed smooth. Whenever she reached for depth, things got complicated. So she learned the rule. Less feeling meant less friction. Less truth meant less tension. Less need meant less risk. But every time she chose less, something inside her quietly disappeared. She stopped sending long messages, stopped sharing the tender details, stopped letting her eyes linger on him the way they used to. like she was still hoping to be found. Because hope, in that house, started to feel like a mistake. Adapting to less isn't peace. It's a form of self-protection that slowly becomes self-erasure. And Claire could feel it. She wasn't just lowering expectations. She was lowering her capacity to believe she deserved more. And the scariest part? She got used to it. Not because it stopped hurting, but because she got tired of hurting out loud. So she hurt quietly and called it love. 7. Inner adaptation. 1. Claire didn't just adapt to Ethan. She adapted to the absence inside him. At first, it looked like patience. Then it became strategy. Eventually, it became instinct. She learned when to speak, and when to stay quiet, when to smile, and when to disappear just enough to keep the balance. Because balance, she believed, was what kept love alive. So she began translating herself. Sadness became, "I'm just tired." Loneliness became, "I'm fine." Desire became silence. Not because she was dishonest, but because honesty started to feel dangerous. Every emotion passed through an internal filter. Will this push him away? Will this make things heavy? Will this cost me the little closeness I still have? And if the answer felt uncertain, she swallowed it. This is how inner adaptation works. You don't change the relationship. You change your nervous system. Claire's body learned the pattern before her mind fully understood it. Her chest tightened before she spoke. Her breath shortened when she needed reassurance. Her voice softened right when it should have been strong. She became fluent in reading Ethan's moods. The distance in his eyes. The pause before his replies. The subtle shift that meant not now. And she obeyed those signals without ever being asked to. That's the quiet cost of emotional unavailability. It trains you to become smaller on your own. Claire told herself she was being considerate, that love meant meeting people where they are. But no one told her that if you meet someone too far away from yourself, you may never fully come back. She started feeling proud of her control. Proud that she didn't need much. Proud that she could handle things alone. But control is not the same as safety. And independence is not the same as being held. There were moments, quiet ones, when Claire noticed how far she'd drifted. Standing in the kitchen, realizing she hadn't shared a real feeling in weeks. Lying next to Ethan, feeling more alone than she ever felt single. Those moments scared her, because they whispered a truth she wasn't ready to face. She wasn't adapting to love. She was adapting to emptiness. And the longer she adapted, the more normal it began to feel. Which is how inner adaptation completes itself. Not with pain, but with numbness. 8. Inner adaptation. 2. There was a moment Claire realized she'd become good at this. Good at not needing. Good at not asking. Good at making everything feel manageable. She could sense Ethan's distance before he spoke. She could predict the nights he'd be quiet. She could hear the invisible warning in his tone. The one that meant, don't go there. So she didn't. And the first thing she lost wasn't him. It was her reflex to reach. Claire stopped sending the second message. Stopped checking if he was okay. Stopped trying to pull warmth out of cold air. Not because she didn't care, but because caring started to feel humiliating. When it wasn't met, she trained herself to want less. And the mind is terrifyingly obedient. If you tell it, this is fine, long enough, it will believe you. But the body keeps a record. Claire's stomach would tighten when Ethan walked in. Not fear. Just readiness. Readiness to read him. To measure him. To adjust. She wasn't living with a partner anymore. She was living with a mood. And in that constant adjusting, she slowly stopped recognizing herself. She'd look in the mirror and feel distant. Not sad. Not broken. Just unfamiliar. Because her emotional life had been put on mute. She still smiled. She still made things easy. She still said, "It's okay," with convincing softness. But inside, she had started speaking a different language. Don't expect. Don't hope. Don't reach first. That's the second phase of inner adaptation. When your heart begins to protect itself. By going quiet. Not outwardly. Outwardly, Claire looked composed. But inwardly, she was packing herself away. She stopped sharing the tender parts. The embarrassing dreams. The small joys. Because sharing felt pointless. If it landed in an empty room. And Ethan, he didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed and preferred it. Because when Claire became quieter, the relationship became easier. No tension. No emotional responsibility. He could keep his distance. And still keep her. That's when Claire understood something brutal. You can be loved in a way that never nourishes you. You can be kept without being cared for. And the deeper grief is this. The person you lose first is you. Claire wasn't just adapting to less. She was adapting to being unseen. And the more unseen she became, the less she remembered what it felt like to be truly held. 9. The cost of staying. 1. The cost of staying isn't always obvious. It doesn't show up as bruises. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic scenes. Most of the time, it looks like a woman who keeps functioning, while something inside her quietly starves. Claire still did the small beautiful things. She remembered Ethan's coffee the way he liked it. Not because he asked, but because she wanted to make life softer for him. She kept the house calm. She kept her tone gentle. She kept her feelings organized. Like if she could keep everything neat, maybe love would finally feel safe. But the body knows when it's paying a price. Claire started waking up tired. Even after sleep. Not physical tired. Emotional tired. The kind that comes from holding your breath for months. The kind that comes from scanning someone's face for warmth and finding none. She noticed how often she swallowed words. I miss you. I need you. Are we okay? They stayed in her throat. Like stones she learned to carry. And carrying became normal. That's the quiet trick of staying too long. Your pain becomes routine. Sometimes Ethan would be sweet. Not deeply present. But polite. A compliment. A quick touch. A, thanks, babe. And Claire would feel the old reflex. Hope. But hope, in a relationship like this, is expensive. Because every time she invested it, she lost it again. The cost also showed up in her self-respect. Not the dramatic kind. The subtle kind. She stopped asking for what she wanted. Then she stopped knowing what she wanted. She stopped expecting care. Then she started doubting she deserved it. And when someone offers you less for long enough, you begin to think less is your portion. Claire didn't feel angry. Anger would have meant she still believed something should change. Instead, she felt responsible. Like if she could just become easier, quieter, more grateful, Ethan might finally relax into her. But love shouldn't require you to disappear. And here's the heaviest cost. She began to miss herself. The version of her that spoke without fear. That laughed loudly. That felt things fully. And didn't apologize for it. That woman was still inside Claire. But she was getting harder to reach. Because staying had trained her to live at half volume. And no one warned her that staying can become its own kind of grief. A grief without funerals. Without endings. Just a slow goodbye to parts of yourself you didn't realize you were losing. 10. The cost of staying. 2. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't come from losing someone, but from living beside the loss every day. Claire didn't lose Ethan. She lost the version of him she kept hoping would arrive. That's what staying does. It turns hope into a habit. And habits are hard to break. Even when they hurt. She would wake up and tell herself, today will be different. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet promise. Like a candle she kept relighting, even in a room with no oxygen. And sometimes, Ethan gave her just enough. A laugh at the right moment. A hand on her lower back in public. Missed you, that sounded real. Those moments were dangerous. Because they made the emptiness feel temporary. They made Claire think, see, he's in there. He's trying. So she stayed. And then the pattern returned. Ethan would drift back into himself. Conversations would stay shallow. Affection would become mechanical. Not cruel. Just absent. And Claire would feel that old ache. The one that doesn't scream. It just spreads. The cost of staying is also this. You start measuring love. In tiny units. A text becomes proof. A compliment becomes oxygen. A moment of attention becomes the entire week's supply of warmth. And when that's the measurement, you stop noticing the famine. Claire's friends would ask, "Are you happy?" And she would answer, "He's a good man." Not, "I feel loved." Not, "I feel safe." Just, "He's good." Because she had learned to describe the relationship without describing her own heart. That's another cost. You become fluent in explaining while slowly disappearing. She didn't leave because she was weak. She stayed because she was loyal. Because she remembered every soft moment and used it as evidence that the hard moments could be endured. But loyalty without nourishment is a slow starvation, and love that requires silence will eventually demand numbness. One night Claire realized something. She was grieving inside the relationship. Not after it. Not because it ended. But because it never fully began. In the place she needed most. Her grief didn't have a date. No anniversary. No single event. Just 1,000 small absences. Stacked on top of each other. Until her heart felt heavy. Even in quiet. And the hardest part? Ethan would never understand the weight of it. Because he wasn't carrying it. Claire was. Alone. 11, the moment she almost spoke. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a dramatic breaking point. It was just a Tuesday kind of quiet. Ethan was on the couch, half present, scrolling. The TV was on, but no one was watching. Claire stood in the doorway with a glass of water in her hand, and for a second, she couldn't move. Because something in her chest rose up, sharp and clear, not anger. Not accusation. Truth. The kind that doesn't come with volume. It comes with weight. She sat beside him. Close enough to feel the heat of his body. Far enough to feel the distance anyway. And she almost said it. Not in a perfect speech. Not with blame. Just a sentence. Small. Honest. "I miss you, even when you're right here." The words sat behind her teeth. Trembling. Claire felt her throat tighten. That familiar warning from her own body. If you say this, something will change. And she didn't know if she could survive the change. Because change could mean conflict. And conflict could mean losing him. And losing him, even emotionally, felt like proof she wasn't enough. So she held it. Ethan looked over, offered a quick smile. "Everything okay?" And Claire could have answered with the truth. "No. Not really. I'm disappearing." But instead she did what she had trained herself to do. She made it smaller. "Yeah, just tired." That's the moment she almost spoke. Not because she lacked courage. But because she had too much history. History of her feelings landing nowhere. History of his quiet shutdown. History of her learning, again and again, that asking for depth would cost her the little piece she had. So she swallowed the sentence. And when you swallow your truth long enough, your body starts carrying it for you. Claire's jaw ached. Her shoulders stayed tense. Her sleep became shallow. Not because life was hard, but because her honesty had nowhere to go. Ethan turned back to his phone. The moment passed. And that's how it happens. A relationship doesn't always break with a scream. Sometimes it breaks with a sentence that never gets spoken. Claire sat there, quiet, smiling like she was okay. While inside, she felt that truth sink lower, like a stone. If I have to stay silent to stay loved, then I am not being loved where it matters. And she didn't say it, but she heard it clearly. 12. Naming the truth. 1. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly. After the moment she didn't speak, Claire noticed how calm everything looked, and how heavy she felt inside that calm. That's when a different question surfaced. Not what did I do wrong? Not how do I fix this? But, what am I actually living in? She stopped calling it confusion. Stopped calling it timing. Stopped calling it a phase. Because those words softened something that was cutting her from the inside. So she tried another word. One she'd been avoiding. Abandonment. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind with suitcases and slammed doors. The kind where someone stays, but never meets you where you stand. Naming it felt dangerous. Because once you name something, you can't keep negotiating with it. Claire sat alone one evening, listening to the quiet she had protected for so long, and realized it had never protected her. It had protected him. Protected him from discomfort, from responsibility, from having to step into her emotional world. And suddenly, everything made sense. Why she felt lonely next to him. Why speaking felt risky. Why loving felt like shrinking. It wasn't because she was too sensitive. It was because she was asking for connection. From someone who had learned to survive without it. This wasn't a failure of love. It was a mismatch of availability. Ethan wasn't withholding on purpose. He simply didn't know how to stay present when emotions asked something of him. And Claire wasn't wrong for needing more. She was wrong for believing she had to disappear to keep him. Naming the truth didn't make the pain louder. It made it clearer. Clear enough to see that her grief wasn't about losing him. It was about losing herself, while trying not to lose him. And once that truth found language, it stopped living only in her body. It moved into awareness, which is where change begins, even before any decision is made. 13. Naming the truth. 2. Once Claire named it, she started seeing herself again. Not the easy version. Not the quiet, agreeable version. The real one. The one she had been shrinking to protect the peace. She noticed how often she apologized for taking up space, for having feelings, for wanting reassurance. She noticed how quickly she explained herself, as if emotions needed a permission slip. And she realized something simple and brutal. She had been trying to earn love by becoming less human. Naming the truth also meant naming Ethan. Not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a man who couldn't meet her in the places that required emotional courage. He wasn't cruel. He was unavailable. And that distinction mattered, because it kept Claire from blaming herself. If someone can't swim, your drowning isn't proof you're too heavy. It's proof you needed help from someone who didn't have it. Claire stopped asking, "Why doesn't he choose me?" and started asking, "Why do I keep choosing what hurts me?" That question was the door, because it shifted the story from him abandoning her to her abandoning herself. She remembered who she used to be. The way she laughed when she was safe. The way she spoke when she wasn't afraid of being too much. The way she felt joy without checking if it would annoy someone. And she grieved that version of herself. Not loudly, but deeply. Because losing yourself is a quiet tragedy. No one claps. No one notices. You just slowly disappear. In the name of love. Naming the truth didn't immediately tell her what to do. But it told her what she could no longer do. She could no longer keep pretending. That numbness was maturity. She could no longer call silence peace when it was actually fear. She could no longer starve and call it devotion. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt something that wasn't sadness. It was self-respect returning. Small at first, like a pulse, like warmth in fingers that had been cold. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew this. She was done negotiating with emptiness. 14. Quiet separation. The separation didn't happen with raised voices. It didn't need witnesses. It happened quietly. The way truth often does. Once it's finally named. Claire didn't announce a decision. She didn't rehearse a speech. She simply stopped pretending. Stopped smoothing the edges. Stopped translating her needs into silence. Stopped shrinking to keep the room calm. And in that stillness, something shifted. Ethan noticed, not all at once, but in fragments. The way she no longer filled the gaps. The way she didn't rush to reassure him. The way her presence felt complete. Even when she said very little. There was a night they sat across from each other. The air between them unremarkable. And that was the point. No tension. No drama. Just a clarity neither of them named. Claire realized then. You don't always leave a relationship. Sometimes you leave the role you were playing in it. She didn't ask him to change. She didn't list her pain. She didn't demand understanding. Because this wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was recognition. She saw him clearly, his limits, his distance, his quiet comfort with absence. And she saw herself, too. How much she had given. How much she had lost. How tired she was of surviving love. Quiet separation doesn't look like distance. It looks like acceptance. Acceptance that love shouldn't feel like endurance. That connection shouldn't require self-erasure. Claire felt grief, yes. But not panic. The panic had belonged to the old version of her. The one who believed silence was safety. Ethan asked, gently, "Are we okay?" And Claire didn't lie. She didn't soften it. She didn't dramatize it. She said, slowly, "I don't think we're growing in the same direction." That was all. No blame. No accusation. Just truth, spoken without urgency. He nodded. Not in agreement. In recognition. Because some endings don't need permission. They only need honesty. And in that moment, the separation became real. Not as a rupture. But as a release. Claire felt it in her chest. The space she had been guarding for him. Opening for herself. Quiet separation is not rejection. It's the moment you stop asking someone to be what they cannot be. And stop asking yourself to accept what you cannot live with. And Claire walked away that night. Without running. Without proving anything. Just whole. 15. Quiet healing. Healing didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as space. The first nights alone were strange. Not lonely. Just unfamiliar. Claire noticed the quiet was different now. It didn't press on her chest. It didn't ask her to be smaller. It simply existed. She started doing ordinary things without explanation. Eating when she was hungry. Sleeping when she was tired. Sitting in silence without wondering if it made someone uncomfortable. And for the first time in a long while, nothing inside her was bracing. Quiet healing doesn't look like happiness. It looks like your nervous system finally unclenching. Claire felt it in small moments. The way her shoulders dropped when she walked into her own space. The way her breath deepened without effort. The way her thoughts stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. She didn't rush to redefine herself. Didn't declare a new beginning. Didn't search for meaning. She let the days be simple. Because simplicity, she was learning, is a form of kindness. Some mornings grief still showed up. Not sharp. Just heavy. She would feel it while making coffee. Or folding laundry. Or standing in the shower. With water running down her back. And instead of pushing it away, she let it pass through. No analysis. No judgment. Just presence. Healing, she realized, isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about no longer organizing your life around it. Claire began noticing her own voice again. The real one. The one that didn't soften automatically. The one that didn't apologize for existing. She laughed one afternoon. A real laugh. And startled herself. Not because it was loud, but because it was easy. That's how she knew healing had begun. Quiet healing doesn't demand progress. It doesn't measure milestones. It asks only one thing. Can you stay with yourself? Now that no one else is deciding the rules? And Claire could. Not perfectly. Not all the time. But enough. She wasn't trying to become stronger. She was becoming truer. And that truth, unforced, unperformed, was finally a place she could rest. 16. Release without words. Release didn't come as a declaration. There was no final speech. No dramatic last look over the shoulder. It came quietly. The way real endings often do. Claire didn't need closure from Ethan anymore. She realized something important. Closure isn't something another person gives you. It's something you stop asking for. And in that moment, she felt lighter. Not happy. Not triumphant. Just unbound. She stopped replaying conversations in her head. Stopped rewriting the past to make it softer. Stopped wondering what she could have done differently. Because she finally understood. Nothing was missing from her effort. Nothing was lacking in her love. What was missing was reciprocity. Release without words means you don't need agreement. You don't need understanding. You don't even need acknowledgement. You simply stop carrying what was never yours to fix. Claire no longer needed Ethan to see her pain. For it to be real. She no longer needed him to change. For her to be free. She began speaking to herself differently. Not with blame. Not with regret. But with compassion. You stayed because you hoped. You stayed because you loved. And now, you're allowed to let go. Those words didn't echo loudly. They settled. Release is subtle. It's the moment you wake up. And don't feel the need to check your phone. The moment you make a decision. Without imagining how it will be received. The moment your body feels calm. Where it once felt braced. Claire noticed her life opening in small ways. More breath. More space. More honesty. And less explanation. She didn't leave with bitterness. She didn't leave with resentment. She left with clarity. And clarity is peaceful. Because it doesn't argue with reality. It accepts it. Release without words is not forgetting. It's remembering yourself. Without pain attached. It's carrying the lesson. Without carrying the weight. And Claire did that. Quietly. Fully. If this story resonated with you. If you've ever stayed too long. Loved too quietly. Or disappeared trying to keep the peace. You are not alone. Please like this video. Share it with someone who might need these words. And leave a comment below. Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories like this. Stories about grief, healing, and the quiet truths we don't always say out loud. Subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We'll be here.